This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, hopefully all of you have been receiving the announcements that I've been putting up for this class. Of course, this Friday you're going to have your quiz during the tutorials, but some of you mentioned how you would like to attend the climate protest, and so while I can't cancel it or postpone the quiz, I have announced the time in which the quizzes are going to be held in those two tutorials that the protest may affect. So you can plan accordingly, at least go to a large part of the protest, come back. Of course, the lecture is recorded. You can watch it any time. And the content of Friday's lecture is, of course, not on the quiz, so it's not that time sensitive. And the reason why I can't postpone the quiz is because the following Friday, September 27th, is a university holiday. It's, and even though in the syllabus it says we have lecture and class, there's no lecture and no tutorials on the 27th. I will ask that you still do your weekly analysis. Of course, you can submit it earlier than Friday, but I'm not going to change the due date. It will be Friday at the normal time, but yeah, you're free to hand it in on Thursday and then enjoy your holiday. So today we're going to talk about atmospheres in architecture. And I think a lot of these somewhat, I consider tangential phenomena in architecture and contemporary architecture that we see now. But first, of course, as usual, I want to give you some background on what I mean by phenomenology and phenomenology in architecture, because that's directly related into this idea of atmospheres. And then go into these other classifications of what I'm doing, clouds, bubbles, globes, and foams. These are not just kind of arbitrary, looking at the contemporary moment and seeing literally these forms in contemporary architecture, but also I want to talk to you and maybe perhaps introduce you to some of these philosophical ideas that are tied, contemporary philosophical ideas that might be underpinning this appearance in architecture of architectural forms that have these forms, clouds, bubbles, so on and so forth. Before we get into atmosphere, and even I want to break down the Bohm, the Guerneau-Bohm reading that you have this week, you have to kind of back up, because now atmospheres is really the trendy term to talk about what was actually discussed many decades ago, and that is phenomenology in architecture. But even before talking about phenomenology in architecture, the idea of just phenomenology is not originally not an architectural term. It was a strain of philosophical thought, mostly based in German philosophy, coming from Germany. It's coming from the 20th century. And it can be understood as a way of quote, understanding a world wherein people and their environment mutually include and define each other, all right? And this is kind of going back to what we were discussing a few weeks ago in terms of systems theory, right? This idea of environment made up of a series of systems, and that the systems work on this closed system, where the systems work on us and vice versa. You know, you think of it also in terms of like a type of ecology. And the key thinkers from this group is the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, and he wrote this canonical work called Being in Time, where he's, you know, the first one to kind of introduce this concept. But there's also a bit later Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and then one that's even more closely starts edging its way into architectural discourse, although the author is, I believe is a sociologist, Gaston Bachelard, is called The Poetics of Space, where this author talks about trying to define what makes space poetic and breaking it down into very simple ideas. And yeah, I remember this is one of, I'll show you some others, but this is one of the books that I had to read when I was a freshman, when I was starting an undergraduate. And, you know, taking that subject and many other subjects, Introduction to Architecture. And so I probably read it, but I didn't really read it. And then I went my third year for a semester in Rome, where I had no TV. Even if I had TV, I didn't understand Italian TV. And there's only very few selection of books. My roommate had some English books, and this was one of them. And as well as another one. And I don't know if it was also being in a foreign environment, closed off from any other distractions, or being in this like very rich, historically rich, new space for me of Rome. But I reread this, and it really resonated with me. I'm like, how come I didn't understand how wonderful this book was? You know, and you know, I even had a journal from that time there, and I have quotations in there, and things. But what I think I liked about the book is that Bachelard talks about things that we have this intuition about, but he actually puts down in words. Like, you know, what's the difference? You know, why are most bedrooms in a two-story house are on the second floor, right? You know, it just and he talks about going up the stairs or going, you know, into the attic. You know, that's where dreams take place, in this type of subconscious space. We don't go downstairs to a basement bedroom, ideally, you know, where it seems more appropriate to go upstairs, to go up, you know, towards the sky, away from the earth. You know, you kind of leave the earth to go exist in this subconscious realm of sleep and dreams, versus going into the ground or going to the basement where it's kind of, you would be making things or getting things dirty or storing things. So it's just, anyway, if you haven't read it, I recommend reading that book, but it's also the first moment where we start to have this the idea of phenomenology enter into architecture. But back to Heidegger. So he believed that being was defined by experiences and events, that being in the world, right, we talked about this, ontology, it was an existence based on a temporal dimension, and that unlike animals, humans are world makers. This is done through language and this, you know, the house, what he called the house of being. So and then later on here we'll talk about also technology. The fact that humans have science and technology is what separates us from just normal human beings. And then of course language. And he writes about this in this book, Being in Time. And he states a quote from this book is that being and time determine each other reciprocally, but in such a manner that neither can the former, being, be addressed as something temporal, nor can the latter, time, be addressed as being. So, yeah. But also in that being is also this idea of space, right? So you can have being without time, you can have time with being. But also within, tied up, within being is this idea of space. You cannot be without some type of presence, and that presence has a location. Now, like I said, when I was studying architecture, these were the first books I had to read, actually, and many of them were, this is like, talking early 90s, but I'm still reading. I didn't realize this at the time, but I'm like, my instructors had no problem giving me a book that was 30 years old to read as an introduction to architecture, or 20 years old, or 10, But I think it was because also phenomenology is a good way to introduce students to architectural ideas, giving them theory to think about architecture abstractly, but without needing too much. Like a lot of philosophy, you don't need to necessarily go back to the Greeks to understand what's going on. And so you have authors, and he was very big also in the 70s. He also writes Christian Norberg Schultz. He also wrote in his first book in the 1965, Intentions in Architecture. And he talks about meaning in architecture. Christian Norberg Schultz, he was a Norwegian architecture scholar. And this is the second book I was reading in Rome, by the way, and I have quotations from this book because this is about not just about a phenomenology of architecture, but a phenomenology of place, of cities, that there's certain types of sensations, or there's certain types of elements within an environment of a certain place that give off certain particular characteristic emotions and I guess you could say senses that we pick up. And that's also another book. I haven't read it in a while, but I remember that made like a very big impression on me, and I was kind of blown away. But maybe you need to go to Rome to read it to have that same effect. I'm not really sure. Another one, I still have this book, is by Charles Moore, the postmodern architect, and Kent Bloomer, who was, I think he's still at Yale. He's an architect. He works a lot on ornament. He's like, in the U.S., like the country's #1 authority on ornament in architecture, even designing ornament for like space. And they wrote this book together, Body, Memory, and Architecture. And that's also an interesting breakdown of, what is phenomenology in architecture. And they look at that. And then this is kind of an oldie, and I kind of remember it kind of boring, but called Experiencing Architecture. We see the date, 64. So this might even be one of the first entree of this idea of phenomenology in architecture. So this idea is not new in architecture. This idea, even, today now, when we talk about phenomenology in architecture, we're thinking of architects and authors such as Stephen Hall. We've already looked at one of the projects by Hall, his edition, museum edition. But he also writes many, many books, and he's considered a phenomenologist within architecture. And it's interesting, it's someone you see it through the practice of his architecture, the representation of it in his drawings and paintings, and then in his writings as well. This is one of the latest ones, Questions of Perception. Also is Alberto Perez Gomez. He's at McGill University, and he is a phenomenologist in architecture. There's also David Leatherborough. He's written actually a really interesting book called On Weathering, and it's about the effects of time on architecture and how do we design in for time when we're designing? Is it, always going, because that building is not always going to be this sparkling, new object, it's going to age throughout time. So how do architects understand that. And even how do you even, present that to a client? Oh, yes, in 10 years' time, it's going to look like this. But it's necessarily something about a concern of architecture. And then all of you probably know Iolani Pallasmaa, who's also wrote a series of books, especially this one, Eyes of the Skin, Architecture and the Senses. He's also an architect as well, but most, I think, academic and known for his writings. And so what is representative of this idea of phenomenology in architecture? Because this isn't a new concept for many of you. I think it's something that you probably have come across in undergrad. So how many of you have heard of the idea of phenomenology in architecture before? Raise your hand. Good. Yes, and this is probably, as it should be, the one philosophy, a theory that you're already quite acquainted with. But that being said, there's also some a certain type of criticalness looked at by some architectural theorists. Number one, and for different reasons. Number one is that it perhaps is not, it's kind of obvious, creating an architecture that responds to the senses is like, you don't need a philosophy about it. It just maybe is something you should consider as, a job as being an architect. It's not this separate thing. And also a lot of projects that these authors and architects are writing about, here is a chapel by Zumthor, which is actually quite interesting, or, museums, or we'll see, I have images of Zumthor's spa in Switzerland. Yes, these are very obvious typologies in which you would want a building to appeal to the senses. But, what is like a phenomenologically driven project like public housing? I don't see Stephen Hall or these architects talking about phenomenology in architecture, or an architecture that responds to the senses in terms of, low budget, less sexy, public housing, office with an office space, an airport. So is it just that this can be applied to certain typologies, this design approach, and to ones that are perhaps have a pretty big budget and for wealthy clients? So that's one idea. But then also, when you have a design approach that's driven from the senses, it has to be first intuited from that architect, right? And usually that architect, is usually an older white male, and that is determining, well, this is the right sense. This is what I feel, and this is what I feel you should, I'm, imposing my will, and this is what I feel you should feel in this space. Whereas maybe another person from another part of the world or a different sex might think, no, that makes me feel uncomfortable. That's good for you. I mean, it could be anybody. What does one person's opinion, it's very subjective, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then the history of architecture, this is a known fact, most architects are male. So it's like one part of the population wants like determining, based on their own senses, what an architecture should be, based on this philosophy of phenomenology. Now, that appears to, same thing can happen even as a woman architect. Why should I impose, or even, coming from the Western world, why should I impose my design sensibility onto maybe others that might have a different? So it's very egocentric, but maybe some of you might think, well, that's okay though. That's why we're trained. That's why we go to school for all these years, to hone those senses. And so I think that's I'm just letting you know, this is one of the critiques of phenomenology in architecture. So that's why I think with Gernot Bohm and others, there's this kind of rebooting of this idea of an architecture appealing to the senses, and it's kind of framed in this idea of atmospheres. Now, Bohm does not, let architects or this idea off the hook. And in your reading, and I'll go over in a minute, he does break it down and show you everything, the good and the bad, or just points out, not even in a kind of judgmental way, what this idea of our atmosphere encompasses. But typically, when you want to talk about, phenomenology and architecture, we're talking about architecture like this. Zumthor, this is a chapel, and actually it was really made in an interesting way, where I believe he bundled up in the core. It's just a very simple shape in the middle of this field. And I don't know if it was a type of timber or like bundled like bamboo or some type of straw or something like that, but some type of material that was bundled up, and then on top of it there was the concrete was poured. And then once that concrete was poured and set, then they set this, I guess, type of formwork on fire, leaving this space hollow. And you get this kind of, not only this texture of these bundles of wood, or I don't know if they were straw, I can't remember, but anyway, this, flammable material, along with this dark, charred, ashy interior, with then these little holes with light shining through the walls, and then also from above, as you can see here. And so, when also we're talking about creating atmosphere or appealing to the senses, this is you can probably smell, appealing to your sense of smell. You can probably smell the outdoors as well. It's very open, simple. There's not really a big delineation between inside and outside like a normal church. You have texture, the walls, very highly sensitive. And then, of course, light that's appealing to the senses kind of as it's cast across these walls. Here's another work by Zumthor. This is his thermal bath in Vaal, Switzerland, where you have the stacked, I believe it's stacked slate walls, looking out, very simple lines. So, minimalist forms where there's also a focus on the materiality of the space, of the light. And of course, this is a space, where your senses are quite aware. You would be going into these spaces probably nude. And so, your sense of touch is heightened. If something's cold, hot, even the bottom of your feet are exposed to touch where normally that wouldn't happen. And then you have the water as well as another sensorial experience. I mean, that's what the whole entire thing about a bath is, that it is a sensorial experience. So you want to kind of heighten that. And it's on, he's using just simple forms here because he wants to just show off the materiality. So let's look, what is this reboot of phenomenology in terms of atmosphere? And a lot of people have written on this. There's a lot of themed issues on this idea of atmosphere and architecture. Even actually where your reading is an excerpt from this book, a larger book, Architecture and Atmosphere, and it's an excerpt that's featured in this issue of Interstices, which is a New Zealand journal of architecture. And before it was translated into English, the book, they had an excerpt, and one of the editors translated it into English. And so, what is Bohm saying here? He claims that aesthetic categories that apply when dealing with human environments are meaning everything that arises from the sensory presence of humans in their environment. So not that different from what, ideas of Heidegger, but kind of building on that. For Bohm, he sees atmospheres, though not as a continuation of systems theory. If anything, it's a critique, and we know, right, systems theory It's a critique of understanding the environment at being influence and input of a series of systems. It's not this ecology. And he feels that there's a problem when we apply information and approaches from the natural sciences to human sciences of the environment, saying they're not the same thing. And Heidegger would probably agree with him on that. And so he's saying, well, let's look at this similar ideas, but let's try to do away with this 1960s, 70s idea of a systems theory. And so just to break through, we'll come to this again. We've already talked about this. So what is systems theory? And from this idea of environment, built environment, it's coming from this realm of systems theory. This is actually, the word environment, this idea of environment, is the kind of, I guess, bridge between the natural sciences and this idea of ecology and the human. I guess it's hard for me not to say the word environment, but, the built landscape. But yes, and so environment in terms of systems theory, as you can see here, there's also two ideas. There's an idea of an open system and the idea of a closed system. And these are coming from, actually, from biology. It's a type of system that when we're talking about certain ecologies or organisms, are they dealing with, there's an input and output? There's still like some type of enclosure, but there's input and output into that enclosure or entity, whether it's a living thing, this kind of boundary, and or is it a closed system? And so at the time, now this is a critique, now at the time during the 60s and 70s, architects were trying to apply these natural systems to architecture. And can we think of architecture in this way? Or can we think of cities this way? But you have this actually, he was a statistician and an engineer who started off at this continuation of the Bauhaus in Germany called the Design School of Ulm, was this academic named Horst Rittel. And he wasn't an architect, he wasn't a designer, but after World War II, in the School of Ulm, design school, it was to set up the school in the hope that design would help rebuild the country after World War II, the country being Germany, and that design would be that vehicle. And so they opened up the school. It was funded in large part by the U.S. as part of the Marshall Plan, and Ulm was one of its main academics there. And he was there because there was this idea that, systems theory and operations research, that this is like early realm of what we call big data. These were systems and ways of understanding the way to increase, or you could say optimize, like manufacturing or the assembly line. But then, how do you also translate or transfer this rigor to design world and the designing of machines and industrial design objects? And so, anyway, I'm talking about this guy, Horst Rittel, but the reason why I'm bringing him up, eventually he would actually move over to immigrate to the U.S. and teach at University of California in Berkeley. But the reason why I'm bringing him up, because this guy's sole basis in his teaching was on systems theory and design. But ultimately, he would come up with this idea of wicked problems. Hopefully you've all heard of this idea of wicked problems. And he wrote this canonical essay. I'll send you the title of it. But basically, he comes to the conclusion after many years that, you cannot directly apply systems theory to design, especially architecture, because it is part of this understanding of what is a wicked problem. It's not just, we can't just apply, these very scientific systems onto design. Now, that might be changing now, but he's writing this in the early 1970s. And he's saying, yes, you can use statistics and this operational research and this idea of systems theory and apply it to cities and urban design. Yeah, that can still work. But in terms of designing architecture, not really. Unless it's like you have this kind of repetitive thing like a hospital, right? Where you have, many, many different hospital rooms that are the kind of same thing. But now with AI, and you can just, and this idea of deep learning, where you can just show a computer, with a camera, this is good design, and it starts to have its own. It's getting tricky now, and if Riddle was still alive today, he might have to then rebuke that. But anyway, I'm kind of getting off topic. But when we talk about big data, it has its roots in this moment, in this understanding of systems theory and operations research. So it's still alive today, but under another term of big data. So, and it's from this idea of systems theory that we have the term and understanding of environment. Actually, and I have a degree that's from Yale University, and it's called a Master of Environmental Design. And it's not about the sustainability or saving the environment. It has nothing to do with that. This is a degree that was set up in 1965, actually with Charles Moore, who I mentioned before was the dean. And it was this, he's coming from California, where they're coming from Berkeley, matter of fact, with where this idea of, I've talked about before, of architecture as this coming together of systems to create an environment. But, so I did a written thesis on factory architecture of Campbell Soup and that assembly line. It had nothing to do with the environment, but that was the name of it. And it's coming from that time and understanding of, okay, now architecture is not just this object in a in this kind of field, It's part of systems that are connected to other systems. And it was really revolutionary, and there's still like legacy of this thought today embedded within our curriculum. I mean, we have a Bachelor's of Environment. And even before, decades earlier, there was also a degree, I think even the school was called like a Faculty of Environments or something like that. So it's still very much with us. But there's a history to this term that starts, especially 1960s. Anyway, so what are we talking about in terms of systems theory and architecture? We're talking about environment, and this is defined as a system that is an entity with interrelated and independent parts. It's defined by its boundaries and is more than the sum of its parts, right? It's on this reciprocity, and change in one part of a system affects other parts and the whole system. So you cannot just take away one thing and not affecting the other parts. Everything is dependent on each other. And the positive growth and adaptation of a system is dependent upon how well the system is adjusted with its environment. Okay, so it's a very like biological or ecological understanding of something. And here, for me, this image by Delagray, which I've told you about, epitomizes that idea. And this is how it was envisioned that we would live in the future in these kind of closed, here this is a closed system environment. So this is what Bohm is critiquing. And so he breaks those down in an attempt to define what is atmosphere into 5 different things. These main groups. And these are moods. Atmospheres are moods in a very narrow sense. Does it create melancholy? Does it have a serious tone, Or as we say here in Australia, is it a vibe, right? You get a vibe, about it's cheerful. Also, another definition is it create a sense of synesthesia. And we've mentioned this before. What is synesthesia? Synesthesia is like when you, it's about the senses, but it's about, having one sense involved in something and then another one reacts to it. Like, if I see the colors combination of red and yellow, then it makes me feel hungry, right? Or if I see a room that's blue, I feel cold. Or if I see a room that's green, I feel nauseous. So seeing one thing brings about another sensation, right? It's not, or if you hear a sound, it's not just seeing. You can hear a sound and then maybe, have a feeling of itchiness or something like that. It's also something that happens when you're, a lot of times, it's a sensation that's described a lot with taking drugs, especially LSD. That was kind of a sensation that people were looking for. States like cold, warm, soft, hard, produced by different sensory qualities in the environment. Atmospheres are about movement, distributions of volumes in space. There's also intersubjective atmospheres by people and impressions, according to Bohm. And then culturally conditioned objects, the central moral effect of colors, like red in one country or in one situation might mean different in red in another, purple or blue. Blue in a early Christian painting, has a certain significance than in another place maybe that purple does, so on and so forth. How do you identify atmospheres? So Bohm has this list of how you can identify them and kind of list certain examples, these generators of atmospheres. One is, the use of music. I'll talk about that in a bit. Illumination. You have the atmospheres when we talk about scenography, a stage. An example of this would be, is the English Garden, where this is type of a realm that is like an atmosphere. It's not just one thing. It's actually not even a built thing. It's like a series of different, contours, views, light, shadow, sense that's creating an atmosphere. Another contemporary example, which we'll talk about in this class, is like how can a park create different scenes to give you different sensations, like almost a narrative, but through the senses, not a literary one, narrative, but one that's based on the senses. This is also an idea in the staging of politics, this appeal to the scenography appealing to the senses. And so what are some examples of this, right? When he's talking about here as a German being very familiar with propaganda. And also, I mentioned him before, the cultural theorist Walter Benjamin talks about this and kind of warns people in his essay, A Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, that these are stage sets meant, used during Hitler's Nazi Germany, these rallies, these kind of to appeal to the senses, to not only even just appeal to the senses, to overwhelm the senses. So you have this overwhelming sense of like power and unity, and you're part of a bigger thing, of the masses. This isn't about rugged individualism. This is about being part of a larger group, and then also having the architecture designed by the architect Albert Speer, and also choreographed the films by Leni Riefenstahl. And so, because you say, and when you say, you know, how, when people ask, oh, how did the Germans go along with Hitler? Well, you have these stage sets that just overwhelmed people, and then you would have also someone filming them. And so these had quite an impact. And so this is what Boehm is talking about when he's talking about oceanography and how this atmosphere can be used to kind of sway people and their attitude by appealing to their senses. And not only, I keep saying appealing, but really overwhelming them. Let me just go back to that list. Sorry. So, staging of politics. Also, there's the use of atmosphere in commodity aesthetics, in the way that objects or products are staged, and it even creates a other type of value. There's use value and exchange value, but there's also stage value, and how a product is placed. Anyone working in retail architecture would know can even increase the value of that, or the seemingly a value by the customer. You know, if you have a Gucci bag that's just kind of, you know, on a regular display like anything else, but if you have it on this kind of bespoke, dazzling crystal table, you know, it increases its value. So the kind of atmosphere around a project can, in itself, increases the perceived value of that product. And advertising, same thing. Staging is not about consumption. It concerns the contribution of consumer goods to the production of a particular living atmosphere. And so, also, again, back to Walter Benjamin, in a different publication it's referred to as the Arcades Project. And it's been comprised after Benjamin, many decades after Benjamin has passed away, into a book. But it's called, the Arcades Project was a manuscript that Benjamin was working on before he actually died. He was part of, just as a side note, I don't know if have I explained Walter Benjamin to this group? All right. So Walter Benjamin was part of this group. This is why he's important. He was part of this group called the Frankfurt School. And this was, of course, a school in Germany. And, it was Germany at the height of the Weimar Republic. And it was seen as, the height of intellectual and of culture. That's also why, Germany, people could say, contributed to Hitler rising to power. But the Frankfurt School, and Benjamin, many of the academics in the Frankfurt School actually were Jews. And Benjamin kind of saw the writing on the wall. And a lot of these academics from the Frankfurt School were able to get out of Germany before, getting caught and sent off to the concentration camps, like Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse. Benjamin did not, but he's an important voice. And so what's the big deal about this Frankfurt School? The Frankfurt School is important because all of these intellectuals, these academics, were writing about the effects of capital on culture. And so, Theodor Adorno was talking about how did capital affect music, and the use of the radio. And how did that change music itself? Also, these different means of receiving and understanding these different types of culture. Horkheimer and Adorno actually, right after the war, this important text called The Dialectics of the Enlightenment. And we've talked, go on and on about the Enlightenment and how it's part of the modernist project. Well, this is after all of the death and destruction of World War II. You have these two intellectuals looking back and reflecting on that moment and saying, what went wrong? We were just talking about rationalizing systems. And basically, in this book, they write about how this kind of hyper-rationalization led to the destruction of World War II, where people could rationalize, in this place of, heightened intellect, Germany, they could rationalize sending off, genocide of an entire people off to a concentration camp. So, that's the dark side of the Enlightenment. And so, when we talk about the failed project of modernism, it's in this book. They point it out where, it's when modernism and the Enlightenment project went wrong, it kind of went off the rails. Now, Benjamin, at this time, is interesting, but this is, before he died. He died trying to escape Germany. I forget exactly when, but during World War II, he tried to escape, go to Spain, and it's a shame. He was waiting in his car, waiting on the border to get in, and next to him on the seat, he had this manuscript, unfinished, the Arcades Project, and he saw the guards coming through and coming up to the cars to inspect what was going on, and he just panicked and he killed himself. He committed suicide. But, which is a shame, because this is an unfinished project, but academics and researchers still find this unfinished manuscript worth so much. It's still a font of information, because it was a series of essays and manuscripts that he would write about, and just walking around, as this, what he called the flaneur, in French, the term, is just this urban wanderer. And the flaneur is not, the flaneur is this archetype that came about as a result of, modernization and the kind of creation of metropolis in the 19th and especially 20th century. So he would go around Paris, where he was living at the time, and writing about all this different phenomena. A lot of them had to do with the built environment and how capital had an effect on the built environment. And one of the big ones was the Arcades Project. And he writes about how this building typology, like we talked about the Panopticon, where it was this viewing machine for surveillance of prisoners, in a different way, the arcades, the Parisian arcades, was this total viewing machine of capital, of consumerism. You would not only see, prostitutes in the windows, trying to entice customers, that's capital of the flesh, but also you would begin to have a type of architecture that would that was made for spectacle and display. And then that's just what he's talking about, Boehm giving value to this. So much so that, you would have what he calls, and Benjamin talks about this, phantasmagoria. And so what is phantasmagoria? This is another type of an overwhelming of the senses that you would see, and Benjamin talks about this in terms of the department stores, of the early department stores of the time. As you can see here, this is the interior of one of the Parisian I believe it's a Parisian department store. And so Benjamin's talking about this built phenomenon that gets kind of formed, and you can even say manipulated and construed from basically capital. This is capital creating these typologies, and he even sees them as a bit absurd. But nevertheless, he's seeing these type of phenomenologies and writing different essays in this book, The Arcade Project. And he talks about this idea of phantasmagoria. And Boehm says, okay, this is an example of that. Also, another overwhelming of the senses occurs, he mentions music. And we even see this, how architecture plays a part in this, not only in retail architecture, the department store, urban manifestations such as arcades for the displaying of goods, but you have here this theater, the Festival House in Bayreuth, which I believe it was designed or helped designed by the composer Wagner. Because Wagner, he was a composer, but and you see how this is all coming from Germany today? But by the way, it's not an accident. The philosophy, the building, these old ideas. And so Wagner wanted not just to compose music, he wanted to create this entire immersive experience for the audience. And so that they would not just be this kind of passive listener and there would be this scene going on. The way that the orchestra is designed, the way the theater was designed, it was to totally encompass and immerse, and overwhelm the senses of the audience viewer. And this has a German term for what he's creating here. Because he's right, he's creating the sound, the composition, the music for each of the players, the theater, the interior. That's called a Gesamtkunstwerk, a German term, which means a total work of art. And it starts here, really, as this idea. So it's not a new idea, what Boehm, but it has a history. And he's saying now, translating these ideas in the 21st century to this idea of atmospheres. But almost at the same time, he's saying, beware. This is how it's used. For a political staging, as we saw with Albert Stier, commercial. I mean, he's not really saying beware. He's just kind of making you aware of this, of the use of atmosphere, both the kind of dark side and so on and so forth. So that's kind of, and I feel like under this larger umbrella of atmospheres are these other kind of types, or at least forms of the 21st century building phenomena that also have a history. So now I want to also talk to you about this idea of clouds in architecture. Your Dorian reading talks about that. I will not go into that necessarily, but just kind of looking at, this is what I want to look at today. I mean, Damisch, Hubert Damisch talks about cloud as matter aspiring to form, where Dorian says it's matter after form. So it's almost, what they're suggesting is this idea, this modernist 20th century idea of form is changing. It's dispersing. It's not, neither this kind of clear delineation, right? What we saw with, say, system theory, right? This clear boundary. But the idea of building or architecture as a cloud is not necessarily new to architecture. During the 60s, I'll show you some examples, some case studies where they were kind of driven toward, they were creating these shapes, these forms. Clouds are this type of dematerialization of architecture. And it's a type of architecture that's aspiring through, or is created through air or pneumatics or mist or fog or glass or light. One of the examples I'm going to talk about, and it's probably one of the first that comes to your mind, is the Blur Building, exposition building by Diller Scofidio. They talk about it as an immaterial design. They're going for this idea of a building as pure atmosphere, the making of nothing. But they want it to be an anti-spectacle, but also talk about it being, quote, a new media landscape. And it's interesting. I mean, this is an interesting concept that they're talking about. These quotations are from Elizabeth Diller, one of the architects of this building, that they wanted an architecture that is made up of the site itself, which is water. I mean, think about that for a minute. Now, again, it's only an expo building, so there's only a certain type of programmatic needs that it has to fulfill. And remember what I was talking about when you see expo or a pavilion structure, we're talking about looking at a tectonics. But what is a tectonics of air? And that's the whole point, right? One of the first, firms during the late 60s to look at that introduce this idea of cloud as architecture is the firm called Krupp Himmelblau. They're Austrian, but they claim that this is the project called the cloud. Now, a lot of this is paper architecture, but they're kind of attempting to express certain ideas of the day. This is 1968. Well, let's talk about what they're looking for. They say their idea of their name of the firm, Krupp Himmelblau, is not a color, but it's an idea. They say it's of creating architecture with fantasy, as buoyant, as variable as clouds. They say a cloud is a differentiated system rather than an object. So they're trying to distance themselves from this idea of architecture as an object. They call the network city as a field of clouds. And so they're building these type of structures that they imagine as a new type of architecture. They even go as far as, in this project here, called as an organism for living. Again, applying those biological, natural sciences terms to architecture. Here's another project that they had, and it was kind of dispersed out into the city, called Space Made in Foam. I mean, this is, is it an architecture or is it an art installation? They don't really delineate that here. And here is another work called Restless Fear, where they would get into this bubble and inflate it, or have it inflated, and then walk around the city inside this bubble, this kind of exo-skin. And so what's going on here? Is this just like a novelty? Is it just a silliness? Or, is there something going on here? At the time, this one editor of, oops, did I just skip something? Yeah, sorry. The editor, Lloyd Kahn, not to be confused with Louis Kahn, we're talking about 1968 now. He was the editor of, one of the architectural editor for Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Catalog. He was like the architecture editor. He also wrote the Dome Cookbook, like Buckminster Fuller's Domes, and he wrote a book. He called it a cookbook, but it was for, people who wanted to drop out of society and establishment culture in the late 60s and 70s and go out and build their own city, and they called it Drop City, and they would use this using structures like dome architecture. And he wrote this book, this manual to help people build their own dome structures. But he is claiming, this is his quote from him. He said that inflatables are trippy, cheap, light, imaginable spaces. They're not architecture at all. They're terrible to work in. The blazing redundant surfaces disorient. One wallows in space. When the sun goes behind a cloud, you cease cooking and immediately start freezing. So he's talking about the impracticability about a cloud or an inflatable architecture that Krupp Himmelblau is talking about. However, this is also representative of a lot of cultural and political changes that are going on in the moment. Again, we're talking 68, early 1970s. And this group, among many other architects, are looking for an architecture that, what is an architecture that is made out of air? These are architects that are part of the counterculture, and they're anti-establishment. So they literally do not want any type of overarching superstructure. And this gets translated into something that's invisible, like air. Because what is the structure or the tectonics of that? Also, there's this idea of nomadism. And actually, it's one of the sections in Whole Earth Catalog. If you have an this is also called, there's a book called The Inflatable Moment. And one of the ideas why these architects were not just Coop Himmelblau, but a lot of different ones, or experimenting with this idea, is this idea of nomadism. And you see it with Super Studio as well, is that, to be anti-establishment means that you don't have to be tied down to one place, that you can roam around and travel, and that you would, maybe there would be this, coming cyberspace and this net, this matrix that you could just plug into, and then you could be totally self-sufficient. And you see that a lot in the work of Super Studio as well. So that's why there was this idea of experimentation with inflatables, with clouds. This is another project called Villa Rosa, where it's a pneumatic construction, and it permits changes in volume due to a new building element, air. And these new forms would influence. They would be supported through projections of color, sound, fragrance, okay? All these different, appealing to different senses, the quality of experience within spaces. The pneumatic prototype is composed of 3 spaces. Here is the plan, or the section of this. You would have, it was made up of 8 inflatable balloons, which vary in size, depending on how you would occupy these spaces. You would also have, it would be foldable within a suitcase. It would be mobile. You would also have a helmet-shaped suit, so when you would leave your kind of enclosed environment, and once you have this air-conditioned shell. And you can see here, this is where you would sleep, these are the different balloons, and it would kind of inflate and then compact into portable size. Here are just some other images. This is like their model of it. Of course, these is just experiments and just kind of putting out the thoughts. But, a lot of these things that were experimental or used to show different concepts of how, architects thought we were going to live or how we may live. A lot of times, they're not to be easily dismissed because, decades later, when we finally do have the technology, they become very relevant. Coop Himmelblau wasn't the only group doing this. You also have Archigram in their design of the Kuschelkopf and the Pseudoloom, where you would have, this shelter. Well, one was a suit that would have all these systems that you could, survive in. This one would be, you would have a TV and a bed, and you would have all these systems to keep you alive in this type of shell. And they would have these types of projects. And here was even a suit, and you can even add another person can come join you in that suit, right? We're talking, 1960s, sexual revolution. And so they're thinking about that. Another experimental project, and we can't look at the Diller Scafidio's Blur building without looking at this project, by a group of artists that were working with engineers called, the abbreviation were called EAT, E-A-T, but it stood for Experiments in Art and Technology. And here, the Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey in the U.S. Sponsored this basically collaboration between 30 of their engineers with 10 different artists from different backgrounds. And that's what started, but then this kind of collaborative would grow and grow, and architects and artists would add to it. And they would do different installations, but one of their most well-known project was this project for the Osaka Expo of 1970 for the Pepsi-Cola company. And so what they created was this building that has a type of exoskeleton, and an artist then had these different spouts where water would spray in because they wanted to give this expression of a cloud on the exterior. Now this kind of shell or dome was then filled with an inflatable sphere that had a was made of reflective mylar, which was kind of big at the time. Now this was being used and developed for the space, the space shuttle wasn't made at this time, but for NASA and their space program, and for the Weather Bureau. So the artists were getting a hold of these new materials and then experimenting with them with the engineers. Here's an image of just the group, and this is what it looks like from what you would see from the outside. And here's a section of the expo building where you have this kind of shell on the outside, not quite a Buckminster Fuller dome, but then an inflatable shell with the reflective surface inside. And what the artists were also going for here was an immersive experience to kind of immerse the sense, a building that would immerse and appeal to all the senses of the exhibition goer. And so you would have, even walking up to it, you would have the mist of the cloud. And then as you entered, they would have different sounds going on. And so with different speakers. So where you would go in the space, it would sound differently. But also, visitors were given a little phone that you could hear different sounds depending on where you were located, different discs around the space. Here's just some other images of it. And this is just an image of them looking at and experimenting with this reflective dome inflatable sphere. And they had lasers and different light shows as well going along with the sounds. Now, this is what it would look like inside the space, where you have the actual occupants and then the reflection on the inside, because you have this complex curve. So it's not just like a flat mirror. This is what happens when you have a reflective interior of a dome structure. And also, this is another scene from the ground level. So I'm going to go through these images because actually I have here it's a bit of a video, but it's a documentary that shows you what it's like in that space. Also, by the way, this is about 20 or 17 minutes. So we'll probably watch this video and then continue on talking what we don't talk about today. We'll just discuss on Friday. Sorry. Copy.
the experience of standing in front of a mirror and seeing ourselves as others see us. But how many of us have stood inside a mirror and seen the world all around us as a reflection of ourselves? A group of young people, artists, engineers, scientists, architects, were fascinated by the possibilities of a new experience, the spherical mirror. They talked and planned, they tried different materials. They found problems they never anticipated. Bouncing light from a spherical surface from inside is something no one really knows very much about. And one of the problems is discussed here by John, an architect.
Well, the problems are that we've created for ourselves a desire to build a spherical mirror, and the mirror is 90 feet in diameter. It's never been done before. And Elsa is the expert in the optics, and I'm dealing with the construction, and the artists have desired this thing. And in the long run, we have to determine what these optics are and how we can relate the very scientific and technical aspect of optics with the principles of construction. And the tolerances are very different. For optics, they're very precise, as Elsa will tell you. For construction, they're rather casual and informal. Sometimes they vary tremendously, and we have to bring those two together. I think that's really what it is.
Well, it's somewhat difficult to calculate the optics unless I know exactly what the artists want. There are two things you can see out of these spherical mirrors. One would be each person could see an image of himself when he looks in the mirror, and he could get an effect very much like the fun houses of a very distorted image of himself due to the spherical mirror. In the other case, the mirror can actually form real images, which could be very exciting, so that an observer could not tell the difference between a real person and the image of that person.
The idea of a reflective spherical surface fascinated these people. It became an artistic, technical feat which required collaboration and careful workmanship, precise to the point of being within a small fraction of an inch in assembling parts. This 20-foot diameter flexible dome is inflated with air to make it expand. In time-lapse photography, we see it grow like a mushroom. And having grown, many of the problems it solved led to new problems inside.
These bumps are caused by the material, which the whole thing is designed as a kind of faceted sphere. So these bumps occur where the maximum lines of stress are. What we'll do later on is to design the amount of stress in the material so that it will be taken up.
A diameter dome is a gigantic effort with a fragile material that is 1/1000th of an inch thick. Full-scale problems can only be solved on a full scale. Here we hear Bruce talking about one of them.
This right here, the round green material here, is completely full of water. There will be one on the inside and one on the outside to allow for the lifting capabilities.
The blowers that maintain the air pressure inside the dome are rated at 0.5 horsepower each. One of them is the main blower and the other one is an auxiliary. The auxiliary one is put onto a cut-in circuit which automatically comes on should the other one fail through fusing or through any kind of fault in the main circuit. When we're blowing the thing up initially, we can flick a switch and have both blowers on at once so that we can get the dome inflated as quickly as possible.
This 90-foot dome was built primarily so we could experiment with light and sound properties not obtainable with the 20-foot model. In a virtual image, the image is like an ordinary flat mirror, where we seem to see the reflection behind the glass of the mirror itself. But here, in addition, we have real images. That is, images that seem to come out mid-air between us and the wall of the dome itself. And I, at this very moment, can see balloons hovering, scaffolding going up and down. There's 3 balloons up there, and 4, 5.
Oh, Tony, that's fantastic!
We're all elated by what we're experiencing here this evening. But this is just the beginning of our experimentation with the possibilities of non-ordinary human perception. Mr. Alan Potash, Vice President of Pepsi-Cola, is here.
Being alive and being with it and being here today and a part of things that are going on means paying attention to the artists, the engineers that are trying to say something, trying to do something, trying to communicate with people all around today. And we feel that our contribution to what's going on as a corporation is to see that those people have a platform from which they can express themselves and their ideas to great masses of people.
And in New York, Larry Owens and Gordon Mumma worked to assemble the programming system for the dome in the Pepsi Pavilion, Expo 70, Japan.
This is the modification panel for the sound system, and it fits in functionally just as you see between the other 2 panels. The first panel, which has the sound inputs from some 32 sources, which are then reduced to 8 sources. And these 8 sources can then be modified individually or in various combinations.
The thought is, with such a unique environment, like a spherical reflecting shell, that it would be interesting to sort of place a person inside a dome-like area like the spherical shell, sort of like to make him feel that he were inside this thing. So that we've placed speakers at various locations all over the spherical shell in a rhombic grid pattern. This is a display of where the speakers are. The dome itself has 3 huge holes in the top, and through the holes shine 6 spotlights, 2 from each of the 3 holes.
The Sheldal Company of Minnesota, makers of the giant Echo satellites, were chosen to manufacture the dome.
We just installed 1 gore into the 90-foot mirror dome, which consists of 72 gores. The material here is a half-mil metallized Melinex, coated with a half-mil fire retardant adhesive, and 3/4-inch wide seal. The gore length is about 82 feet. This is just a model dome that we built to use for our erection procedure and to practice holding it and to see what problems we might encounter out in the field that we don't anticipate yet. Up to now, it looks like everything is as we planned. Right now, we'd like to pressurize it and see at what pressure it'll fail or where it's going to fail. It'll tell us the areas that we should look at when we're leaving it.
The final destination of the dome, Expo 70, is the first World Exposition to be held in Asia. Estimates project over 100 million visitors for the 6-month period. Of these, over 10,000 people per day will pass through the Pepsi Pavilion. A team of over 200 artists and engineers, as well as scores of workmen, strained to meet the March 15 deadline set for the opening. To create a perpetual cloud over the dome, engineer Tom Mead collaborated with sculptor Fujiko Nakaya to fashion the world's largest man-made fog system.
There are many ways of making fog, using chemicals or using refrigeration, using the water vapor content of the air. By cooling it, we can produce fog. For this Pepsi Pavilion, we chose pure water fog so that people can feel it and play in it, hide in it. For me, this is a fog sculpture. And sculpture, I say sculpture because it's a negative sculpture because air, the atmospheric condition sculpts the fog. It will be changing its shape all the time depending on the weather conditions. I wanted enough fog to hide the building so that I wanted the whole pavilion to be a sculpture.
Composer David Tudor initiated plans for a laser deflection system that activates the color components of an intense light beam to create a dynamic light shower for those entering the dome. Set upon a metal base, an intricate system of prisms and mirrors will break up and direct the light, with a plastic casket providing protection for the highly tuned component parts.
The eventual destination of all these things is down in that little room if you want to start tearing them down.
All this activity had to meet the common deadline for the grand opening of the dome. Billy Kluver is president of Experiments in Art and Technology, the group of artists and engineers which initiated and interfaced the Pepsi Dome project.
I believe that the Pepsi-Cola Committee will set a precedent in new corporate participation in the arts.
Among those attending is Donald Kendall, president of Pepsi-Cola.
This pavilion invites all to share in its delights and to find in them some reassurance that mankind is capable of progress and harmony.
As the ancient Shinto rituals bless the occasion, old and new meet in unique contrast, with sound of flutes reverberating from that mylar surface of the dome. Mrs. Shimazu, formerly a princess of the royal house, came to cut the ribbon. The dome seems to show that today, people are more and more eager for new sensory experiences. The darkness of the entrance tunnel conditions the eye for the patterns of the laser light shower. Inside the mirror room high above, real images of sound and light appear suspended in space, upside down. The small handsets are given to augment the audio system with localized sound effects. Sound waves behave essentially the same as light. The visitor is virtually inside a mirror of sound. For artist Bob Whitman, all this has a special meaning. 4 years ago, his experiments in optics led to the initial concept.
This is an incredible funny pipe. It's also the biggest artwork in the last 50 years, just in terms of energy and resources that we put into it. The first thing I think that the pavilion was about was not telling anybody what to do. You want people to be free, and you want them to understand that, you want them to accept that responsibility, you want them able to look at what they want to look at, see what you want to see, sort of to escalate his mental involvement into a real one in the real world. It's a philosophical machine that I think everybody knows works.
Okay. So you need to know that work then to really understand this work, right? The Blur Building by Diller Scofidio, decades later. But, and you can't look at one and not think that the architects knew of that project and were looking at it and were inspired by it and wanted to make their own version of it for this expo, but using other terms. Because there is a significance that this is on the lake. They claim they want to make an architecture of the site, but also they're using, basically the same, a lot of similar concepts, and it's a building that the visitor is immersed in, and they're immersed in the site as well. This is the actual, structure, this kind of platform. And I think that originally they wanted to use the water from the lake, but I think in the end, I'm not sure if they could actually do that. But you would enter the space, and you would, actually, even before you would enter the space, the architects would have you put on this raincoat, and then also you would also fill out this data form about your likes, what you don't like. And in the jacket, there was this, I guess you could say, device that took all that information, that data that you would put in, and along with other people. And so while you're walking around in the mist, your jacket would light up or turn different colors according to, your movement throughout the space and your adjacency to other people who also would like similar things that you did. Then you both would have like a certain glow or light. And so they did at, whereas the EAT had the individual telephone so that you could hear different sounds. And of course, this is being sponsored by Bell Telephone, so they had to have these type of phone-like things, futuristic, in the EAT. Diller Scofidio did something different, using data and likes and don't likes, and this is, actually it's quite innovative for 2002. So anyway, we will leave it at this, on this project, and on Friday talk about more contemporary examples of the cloud formation, along with bubbles and foam. Thanks.